There is a name at the bottom of a list: 12 men. You have heard most of them in Sunday school songs and stained glass. Simon, who would be called Peter; James and John, the brothers who wanted to call down fire; Andrew; Philip; Thomas, who needed to touch the wounds before he could believe. And at the very end of the list, in almost every telling, comes one more name. The gospel writers add a small phrase after it, almost like a warning label, almost like they cannot bring themselves to write the name alone: Judas Iscariot. And then the words, the one who betrayed him. Now here is the question nobody wants to sit with, because it is uncomfortable, and it should be. Jesus is the one who picked these 12. He is the one who stayed up all night in prayer before he chose them, according to Luke. He did not draw names from a bowl. He did not get tricked. He looked at a crowd of followers, and he pointed at specific men, and he said, "You, come with me." And one of those men he pointed at, one of the faces he looked into, was the face of the man who would sell him for the price of a slave. So why did he do it? This is not a story about a villain in a cloak. This is not a story about a monster who was born to be evil. This is not a story about a puppet who never had a choice. This is a story about a man who was trusted, who was chosen, who was loved, and who walked away from all of it in the dark. And about a God who kept calling him friend right up until the kiss. Stay with me, because the secret hiding inside this story is going to change the way you read your own worst moment. Let's go back to the beginning. When Jesus called Judas, he was not calling a stranger. That is the first thing you have to understand, and it is the first thing most people skip right over. Look at the other 11. Almost all of them are Galileans, fishermen from the north, rough hands, salt in their hair, the accent of a backwater province that people in Jerusalem looked down on. Peter, Andrew, James, John. Country boys. But that last name is different. Iscariot. Scholars have argued about that word for centuries, and the strongest reading is this. In Hebrew, Ishkarioth, a man from Kerioth, a town in the far south, in Judea. Do you see what that means? If it is right, then Judas may have been the only southerner in the group, the only one who was not a Galilean. He was the outsider who got let in, the one who did not have to be there, geographically, historically, and Jesus reached across all of it and said, "You too, come." And here is what Jesus did next, and it should stop you cold. He handed Judas the money. The Gospel of John tells us plainly that Judas kept the money bag for the whole group. He was the treasurer. When people gave to Jesus and the disciples, when there were funds for food and for the poor, Judas held the purse. Think about what that means in a group of 12 grown men who barely trust each other, who argue about who is the greatest. The one they let hold the money is the one they trust the most. That was Judas. Now here's the part nobody tells you. John, writing decades later, adds a bitter little note. He says Judas kept the bag, and he used to help himself to what was put into it. In other words, John is telling us that Judas was skimming, stealing quietly, coin by coin, from the ministry of the Son of God. But, and this matters, nobody caught him, not the other 11. When Jesus said at the last meal, "One of you will betray me," the disciples did not turn and stare at Judas. They did not say, "Well, obviously, it's him." They looked around the room, confused, frightened, and each one of them asked the same terrible question. Is it me? That is how good Judas was at hiding. That is how normal he looked. He was not wearing the mark of a traitor on his face. He looked exactly like a disciple. He walked exactly like a disciple. For 3 years, he ate the same bread, slept under the same stars, watched the same blind eyes open, and the same dead man walk out of a tomb. And the whole time, something in him was rotting so slowly that not even the men next to him could smell it. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone who sat across the table from you, smiling, while something in them had already decided to leave? Hold that thought, because there is a dinner coming where you will feel the full weight of it. There is a moment, about a week before the end, that pulls back the curtain on Judas more than any other. And it happens at a dinner in a town called Bethany. A woman named Mary comes into the room. She is carrying an alabaster jar of perfume, pure nard, John calls it, imported. The kind of thing a family saves for a lifetime, worth about a year's wages for a working man. And she does something that would have made every jaw in the room drop. She breaks the jar open, and she pours the whole thing out on the feet of Jesus, and she wipes his feet with her hair. The house fills with the smell of it. You could not have hidden that scent if you tried. It clung to everything. And in that holy, extravagant, breathtaking moment, one voice cuts through the room, cold, practical. Judas. Why wasn't this perfume sold, he says, and the money given to the poor? And you know what? On paper, he sounds right. He sounds generous. He sounds like the responsible one, the one thinking about people who are suffering while everyone else gets swept up in emotion. If you were in that room, you might have nodded along. That does seem wasteful. He has a point. But John, who was there, tears the mask off for us. He tells us Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor. He said it because he was the one holding the bag, and he wanted that money in the bag so he could take from it. Here is what most people miss. Judas had learned to dress up his greed in the language of virtue. He had learned to make his theft sound like compassion. And that is the most dangerous kind of corruption there is. Not the corruption that knows it is evil. The corruption that has convinced itself it is doing good. And Jesus, who saw all of it, did not expose him. He did not stand up and say, "Everyone, watch out. This man is a thief." He simply defended the woman. "Leave her alone," he said. "She has done a beautiful thing." He protected Judas's secret one more time. He gave him one more chance to turn around. Judas did not take it. Before we walk into the last night, I want to ask you something directly. If you are getting anything out of this, if this story is landing somewhere real for you, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to open up the hardest, most human corners of Scripture, the parts most people rush past. And if a story like this deserves more than a rushed reading, then let me know in the comments. I read them. Now, come with me to the upper room, because everything is about to change. It is Thursday night, the last night, and Jesus knows it. Earlier that week, something happened that the Gospel of Matthew records in 3 short verses. Judas went to the chief priests, the men who wanted Jesus dead, and he asked them a question that should make your blood run cold. "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" And they counted it out. 30 pieces of silver. Now, if you know your Old Testament, that number is a punch to the stomach. Because in the book of Exodus, 30 pieces of silver is the price the law sets. Not for a king, not for a prophet. It is the compensation you pay when your ox gores someone's slave to death. 30 pieces of silver is the going rate for a dead slave. That is what the Son of God was worth on the open market that week. And centuries earlier, the prophet Zechariah had written a strange, sorrowful line about being weighed out for 30 pieces of silver and having it thrown into the house of the Lord. Judas did not know he was walking straight into an ancient poem, but he was. Here is the word the Gospels use for what Judas did. In Greek, it is paradidomi. It means to hand over, to deliver up, to give into someone's power. And here is the thing that will keep you up at night. That exact same word, that same verb, is used elsewhere in the New Testament for what God the Father did. Paul writes that God did not spare his own Son, but handed him over for us all. Same word. Judas handed Jesus over for silver. God handed Jesus over for love. The betrayer and the Father used the same door, and only one of them walked through it in the dark. Now watch what happens at the table. They are eating the Passover meal. Bread, wine. The old story of a lamb whose blood saved a people. And in the middle of it, Jesus goes quiet, and then he says it. "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The room comes apart. Peter is desperate. John, who is leaning back against Jesus, whispers, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answers in a way that only the two of them understand. "It is the one," he says, "to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it." And then Jesus takes a piece of bread. He dips it, and he hands it to Judas. You need to understand what that gesture was. In that culture, at that table, taking the choice morsel and dipping it and handing it to someone was not an accusation. It was an honor. It was what the host did for the guest he wanted to bless. It was a seat of favor. It was the gesture of a friend. Jesus had one last thing to say to the man about to sell him, and he said it not with a curse, but with a piece of bread pressed into his hand. He was saying, even now, Judas, there is still a place for you here. And the gospel says that the moment Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Whatever door had been cracked open for years finally swung all the way wide. And Jesus looked at him and said, "What you are about to do, do quickly." Judas got up, and he went out. And John writes one of the most haunting sentences in the entire Bible. Just 4 words to end the scene, and it was night. There is a garden across the Kidron Valley. Olive trees, old and twisted, silver in the moonlight. It is called Gethsemane, which means oil press. And that is exactly what it becomes for Jesus that night, a place of crushing. He prays until he sweats blood. He asks the Father, "If there is any other way, let this cup pass." There is no other way. And while he is still praying, you can hear them coming. Torches through the trees, the clank of soldiers, a crowd with clubs and swords, and leading them, at the front, walking ahead of the men who came to arrest the Son of God, is one of the 12. Judas had given them a sign. "The man I kiss, that's him. Arrest him." Think about the cruelty of that sign. In that world, a kiss on the cheek was how you greeted a rabbi you loved. It was reverence. It was affection. It was the gesture of a disciple to his master. Judas took the most tender thing in his whole world and turned it into a weapon. He weaponized affection itself, and he walks up to Jesus in the dark, and he says, "Rabbi," and he kisses him. Now, I told you at the very beginning of this that in the garden, Jesus would speak one word to the man handing him over to death, and I told you it would not be the word you expect. Here it is. Luke records Jesus asking, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" But Matthew gives us the word. Jesus looks at the man who has just marked him for crucifixion with a kiss, and he says one thing. In Greek, it is heteros, friend. Friend, he says, do what you came to do. Sit in that for a second. He does not say, traitor. He does not say, snake. He does not say, how dare you. The last recorded word Jesus speaks to Judas before the soldiers grab him, while the betrayal is literally still warm on his cheek, is the word friend. Not the deep word for a beloved brother, a cooler, sadder word. The word you use for a companion who has become a stranger, a friend who is no longer acting like one. It is grief with its arms still open. That is the heartbreaking secret hiding at the center of this entire story. Jesus never stopped seeing Judas as a person. He never reduced him to the crime. Even in the worst moment, he held the door open one final inch, and Judas walked past it. Here is where I have to show you the saddest comparison in all of Scripture. Because Judas was not the only man who betrayed Jesus that night. Peter did too. While Jesus is being tried, Peter is standing in a courtyard warming his hands by a fire. And 3 times, 3 separate times, people point at him and say, "You were with him." And 3 times Peter denies it. The 3rd time he swears, he curses, he says, "I do not know the man." And a rooster crows. And Peter remembers that Jesus told him this would happen. And Peter goes out and weeps like his heart is being torn in half. So now you have 2 men. Both loved Jesus. Both walked with him for 3 years. Both failed him catastrophically on the same terrible night. Judas handed him over. Peter denied him. If you are keeping score of the sin, they are both drowning. So why is one of them a saint and the other a curse? It is not the size of the failure. Watch closely. Matthew tells us that when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. He felt it. He went back to the priests. He threw the 30 pieces of silver on the temple floor, and he said 7 of the most honest words a guilty man has ever said. "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood," he confessed. Do you hear that? Judas confessed his sin, out loud, more clearly than most of us ever will. He knew exactly what he had done. He named it. He hated it. And then he did the one thing that made all the difference. He took his guilt, and instead of carrying it back to the only one who could forgive it, he carried it out to a field, and he ended his own life. That is the difference. That is the whole difference. Peter's failure drove him toward Jesus. Judas's failure drove him away from Jesus. Peter wept and came back. Judas wept and ran. One believed there was still mercy waiting for him. The other decided his sin was bigger than the love of God. And that, right there, is the real tragedy of Judas Iscariot. It was never that his sin was too great to forgive. The hands he handed over to be nailed to a cross were the very hands that would have caught him if he had turned around. The blood he sold for silver was the very blood that could have washed the silver off his soul. Forgiveness was standing 3 days away. He just could not believe it was for him. Let me say this to you plainly, because someone hearing this needs it tonight. There is no failure you can bring to God that is larger than His mercy. The mistake Judas made was not the betrayal. Peter got past the betrayal. The mistake was believing he was too far gone to come home, if you have ever felt that you have done the one thing that puts you outside of grace. I need you to hear that this story was written to prove you wrong. The Bible tells us how Judas died. He went out and hanged himself. Acts adds a grislier detail, that he fell headlong and his body burst open in the field he bought with the blood money. The people of Jerusalem gave that field a name. In their language, Ekeldama, the field of blood. You can still argue about its location today, and the early church could not let the story go. A church father named Papias, writing not long after the apostles, passed down a horrifying, exaggerated account of Judas's end, bloated and grotesque, the kind of story people tell when a betrayal is too big to make peace with. Centuries later, someone even wrote a strange Gnostic text called the Gospel of Judas, trying to flip him into a secret hero. The world has never known what to do with this man. We keep trying to make him either a monster or a martyr, because the truth is harder than both. The truth is, he was one of us. He was a man who was chosen, who was trusted, who was given the bag, given the bread, given the friend, who was loved to the very last second, and who could not, or would not, believe it. The 11 who were left eventually chose a man named Matthias to take his place among the apostles, so that the number would be whole again. Life went on. The gospel went out to the ends of the earth. But there is a wound in the story that never fully closes, and maybe it is not supposed to, because every one of us has a little of Judas in us, the part that hides things, the part that dresses up wanting in the language of good, the part that, when we fail badly enough, is tempted to believe we are beyond bringing back. So let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. First, Jesus chose Judas with his eyes wide open. He knew. From the beginning, John says, Jesus knew who would betray him. This was never a trick that got played on God. Jesus chose to love a man he knew would sell him, which means the love was never conditional on being deserved. He does the same with you. Second, the distance between Peter and Judas was not the size of their sin. It was the direction they ran afterward. When you fail, and you will, everything depends on which way you turn, toward the fire and away, like Judas, or toward the one you failed, in tears, like Peter. The door is the same door. It is always open. You just have to walk back through it. And third, this is the one I want to lodge in your chest tonight. The last word Jesus ever spoke to his betrayer was not a curse. It was the word friend. If he could say that to the man kissing him into a grave, then there is no version of you, no failure in your history, no night so dark that puts you past the reach of that same voice. He is still saying it, over the worst thing you have ever done, friend. So here is what I want to know, and I want you to actually tell me in the comments. When you look at these 2 men, Peter who came back and Judas who ran, which one do you see more of in yourself right now? Be honest. Somebody down there needs to read your answer. Judas had every reason to believe he was loved. He held the money. He got the bread. He heard the word friend. And it still was not enough, because he would not receive it. Don't let that be your story too. The door is still open. Walk through it.